Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in and thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. I'll try my best to upload more than one video every Sunday, but if circumstances do not allow me to do so, I ask for your forgiveness. Anyways, this lesson is in continuation of the previous video that I uploaded. This is Types of Research Part 3, and we're going to talk about exploratory, explanatory, and experimental research. So before we begin the class, I'd like you to take a look at this book. This is Paper 1 book by KVS Madan, latest edition, and it contains all the 10 topics, including previous year questions, which are very important. And you'll find MCQ at the end of each chapter for practice. And I used this book to clear the exam actually, and it helped me a lot, and I'm sure it will do the same for you. So I got this book just yesterday and I'm quite excited, and I want you to buy this book. Exploratory research. Exploration of a problem area before conducting the proper research. So as the name itself suggests, it is an exploration, but exploration of what? Of a problem area before conducting the final research, the proper final research. In brief, it is the preliminary round before we dive into the main show, okay? So generally it is done at the beginning of a research to explore an area where little is known or to investigate the possibilities of undertaking a particular study. So let's say there is an area of interest that you'd like to conduct a research on. So your first job is to explore that area so that you can determine if it will be possible to study the area at all. Okay? A small scale study to decide whether it is worth carrying out a detailed investigation. So it helps you in weighing the pros and cons of the situation and the overall decision-making process, and accordingly you can decide whether it's worth going ahead with the research. So exploratory research is very helpful in that sense. It helps us to have a better understanding of the problem, not intended to offer final conclusive solutions to the problem. So the main purpose of exploratory research is to simply give us a better understanding, a better insight. It is not intended to give us the final solution, the final conclusive solution to the problem. Okay? The purpose of this research is to gain information, define terms, clarify the problems, develop hypotheses, objectives, research questions, etc. It makes use of secondary data, surveys, case studies, interviews, mainly focus group interviews. The example given here is the use of technology in school education. So let's say you want to study this area. Then what you have to do is, first you have to do an exploratory research of this area by making use of this data, surveys, case studies, and all the existing literature and interviews. Explanatory research. So this is also known as causal research. What is causal? The meaning of causal according to dictionary is acting as a cause. Okay, so keep this in mind. And it is counted under experimental research. It addresses the question why things happen. So it focuses on analysis of a situation or a specific problem to explain patterns of relationships between variables. So, the main purpose of explanatory research is to explain. The name explanatory says it all. Its job is to explain. Explain the patterns of relationships that exist between variables. And it determines the extent and nature of the cause and effect relationship. So this is where the element of experimental research comes into the picture. It studies the cause and effect relationship, and explanatory research will try to explain why that relationship exists. Conducting experiment is the most popular method of explanatory research. Examples are: why smoking causes cancer, why use of technology increases efficiency in students. So, never forget, the main purpose of explanatory research is to explain why things happen. So, exploratory research addresses what, and explanatory research addresses why. Now we have experimental research. So we will be focusing on two types of experimental research: true experimental and quasi-experimental. Before we move ahead, let us look at these three very important characteristics of an experiment or an experimental research. What are they? An independent variable is manipulated, meaning the independent variable is controlled or influenced by the researcher. Keep this in mind. Second, all variables except the independent variables are constant. So all the variables except the independent variable are constant. Their values will not change at any point in the experiment. Okay? And lastly, the effect of manipulation of the independent variable on the dependent variable is observed. So, the job of the experimenter is to observe carefully what is happening to the dependent variable as a result of the independent variable being manipulated. Okay, so the researcher will play with the IV, the independent variable, and observe the resulting effects on the dependent variable, dV. So these three very important characteristics should always be kept at the back of your mind, okay? Let's start with true experimental research. It is a type of experimental design considered to be the most accurate type of experimental research, because a true experiment supports or disproves a hypothesis using statistical analysis. So this means that this type of research or experiment will make use of statistical figures and numbers to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So since it is backed by statistics, it is very reliable. So there are three criteria that must be met in a true experiment. First, we have control group and experimental group. Control group is a group of research participants that resemble the experimental group but do not receive the experimental treatment. It provides a reliable data to which you can compare the experimental results, and the control group remains unchanged and normal. Experimental group is the group of research participants that receive the experimental treatment exposed to the independent variables. So for a better understanding of the concept of control group and the concept of experimental group, I have prepared a very rough illustration of an experiment. So let us check it out. So this is an experiment. We want to study the effects of pesticides on plants. So we have two groups, control group and experimental group. And one thing that we should note is both of these groups should be identical to each other. That means they should not be that different from one another. So the experimental group receives the treatment. So what is that treatment? That treatment is the pesticide. And the pesticide is the independent variable of the experiment, okay? And on the other side, the control group receives no treatment. That means it is not exposed to the independent variable, the pesticide. And the control group is kept under normal conditions. It should be kept under normal conditions and it should remain unchanged, while the experimental group is exposed to the pesticide. So after a week, we check the results of the experiment and we compare the results of experimental group with the control group. So, control group is mainly used for the purpose of comparison. We compare whatever results we have received, and after that we can study the differences and the effects in depth. So this was a short demonstration of what control group and experimental group are. And second, we have researcher manipulated variables. So as you know, in an experiment, the researcher has to manipulate at least one variable, and that variable is called independent variable. In true experiments, the researcher has to change or manipulate the variable that is meant to affect the outcome variable. The outcome variable is the dependent variable that is being studied. Independent variable is controlled by the researcher. Dependent variable or outcome variable is the outcome or the effect that the researcher is studying. And lastly, we have random assignment. So whoever gets to participate in the experiment should be randomly chosen. Okay? That is what it means by random assignment. The researcher shouldn't choose them deliberately. This is important. Why? Because each participant has an equal chance of being assigned to each sample group. And what do you mean by sample group? It could be either control or experimental group. And it ensures group similarity and intends to produce equivalent groups. And lastly, we have quasi-experimental research. So what is quasi? Say from a distance, a thing looks very real. This thing looks to be very true. Okay? But when you go and take a closer look, it definitely was not what it looked like from a distance. So it seemed to be true from a distance, but when you take a closer look, it appeared to be false. Okay? So quasi-experimental research has many features close to that of experimental research, but it is not true experimental research. There is scope for manipulating the independent variable, but the participants are not randomly assigned to experimental groups, contrary to true experimental research. So in true experimental research, there is random assignment. But in quasi-experimental research, there is no random assignment. So that is the main point of difference between true and quasi-experimental. Okay? The researcher uses certain selected groups. So here the researcher will consciously choose those who get to participate in the experiment, rather than assigning individual at random. Quasi-experimental research is used when randomization is impractical or unethical. So an example here is, we want to study the self-esteem level of overweight people. So can you make someone overweight for a day or two? No, you cannot make them lose or gain weight just like that. So that is impractical, that is unethical. And next is assignment occurs naturally without the researcher's intervention, like gender differences. So gender differences occur naturally. So an example is, we want to study and compare the IQ between males and females. So males and females are naturally occurring phenomena. So there is no way the researcher can make an individual a male or a female. You cannot interfere with nature, right? So that is when quasi-experimental research proves to be helpful. So let us start solving MCQ. Which research approach is the most appropriate to establish a relationship that is causal in nature? The answer is experimental research. The type of research that tests hypotheses and theories in order to explain how and why a phenomenon operates as it does is explanatory research because it seeks to explain how and why a phenomena occurs. Okay? The strongest evidence for causality comes from which of the following research methods? Experimental, causal comparative, correlational, none of the above. The answer is experimental. The essence of the experimental method is A. The correct calculation of Karl Pearson's coefficient of correlation, obtaining direct reports from subjects about their subjective experience, careful measurement and record keeping, using control to identify cause and effect connections. So our answer will be D. Which type of research is likely to provide the strongest evidence about the existence of cause and effect relationships? Our answer will be B. Experimental. Which research method is most appropriate if a researcher is looking for a causal relationship? The answer will be experimental method. So we have come to the end of this class. If you found this video useful, then please leave a like. And if you have a question, leave a comment. And if you're new to this channel, then please hit that subscribe button and share this video with your friends. Anyways, see you next week. Take care. Bye.